Hello listeners, Jordan here. I just want to let you know that you can listen to Nighttime early and ad-free on Amazon Music. Include it with Prime.
You are tuned to the Nighttime Podcast, focused on the fringe of Canada.
Hello listeners. In my opinion, this is the most wonderful time of year. Halloween. I love the cool weather, I love the look of an orange and red forest, and of course, I love our temporary celebration of all things dark and eerie. For a few weeks in October, even your grandmother's favorite drugstore will be selling skull-shaped coffee mugs and blood-splattered napkins. What's not to love about that? Now, seeing as the world has transitioned to one of horror and darkness, I'd like to do the same here on Nighttime, but I find it a little tough. I suppose this show exists in a sort of perpetual state of Halloween. But fortunately, there are many spooky listeners of this show, and it's to them I turn to tonight. Earlier this month, I made a post across the various Nighttime social media accounts requesting listeners who believe they've had an encounter with the supernatural to contact me. And, well, they didn't disappoint. Just as I had expected, you, the listeners, are as haunted as any decrepit farmhouse. And we're about to hear all about that. Let's get into it. Pour a drink, dim the lights, and get yourself cozy. Tonight, in this Halloween special of Nighttime, we're going to hear from some Nighttime listeners who will share their encounters with the beyond. I got your message on Twitter. I'm so delighted to hear your story because I know the river it's set at. But before we get there, tell me who you are and where are you from?
I'm James Forsey. I'm from Cape Breton Island, Nova Scotia.
The most beautiful island on the planet, by the way.
God's country.
Coincidentally, I'm from there as
Yes.
well. So it's a beautiful place. And in your message to me on Twitter, you told me that the story takes place on the Margaree River, is that right?
That's right. Actually, to delve deeper into it, it took place on a pool called the Cemetery Pool, which you cannot make that up.
Fitting.
I know, it's so cliche, yeah.
Mm-hmm. So when did this happen? Let's set the scene for me.
So this happened in 2011. It was just a few months after the Margaree River had a huge flood where they washed out bridges and things like that. And when you go to fish the Cemetery Pool, which is way up in Big Interval, it's basically the last pool you can fish on the Margaree River before the river closes to salmon fishing. And you usually park at the cemetery and you walk across the head of the pool and then come down the other side and fish it. But because the river was so high, you have to actually drive over the Big Interval Bridge and park at the quilt shop there and walk down through this long trail through the woods. But because there was a flood a few months earlier, there was no trail in the woods. So when I got there to the quilt shop, there was a bunch of us gearing up, and I said, "Well, I'm not waiting for you guys. I wanna run down the river and get fishing," because I knew the conditions were optimal. So as I'm beating it through these alders and brush and rose bushes and everything else, trying to get down the river, I just I heard this voice go. It's so funny, like people laugh at it, but it's true. This voice said, "Yoo-hoo," and I looked over, and there's this man standing there, and I said, "Oh, hey, how you doing?" And he had a Tilly hat on. He had like straw hair. He was this old fella, glasses, had this old pair of green waders on, And I said, "Oh, how you doing?" He said, "You're looking for the river?" I was complaining about the trail being washed out and everything, and he said, "Yeah, just you're not far." And I said, "Were you down there fishing yourself?" He said, "Yeah." He said, "I was down there, me and one other guy." He said, "The guy down there fishing now, he got a salmon there about an hour ago." I said, "Oh, okay, cool." And I said, "Well, have a good day." And off he went. So I got down to the river, and sure enough, there was one guy fishing there, and my buddies were still up at the quilt shop or up making their way down too. And I walked up and started talking to the guy fishing there, and I said, "So I heard you just lost, had a salmon." And he said, "Yeah." He said, "I just had one about an hour ago." Goes, how did you know that?" And I said, "Oh, that guy that you were just fishing with, I just passed him in the woods here." He goes, "No, nobody's been fishing with me here today." He said, "I've been fishing here alone." I said, "No, the old guy that I just passed in the woods, you know." And he said, "No." He said, "Dude, I've been fishing here alone all day." And I said, "Wow, that's strange." And so my buddies came down through the woods, and I said, "You guys run into a guy in the woods or anything?" And they're like, "No." And anyway, I said, "Wow, that's kind of odd." So anyway, I never thought anything of it, and I came home that night, and my wife and I were just having supper, and she tells me that her coworker said he saw a ghost on the Margaree River that day. And I looked at her, I was like, what are you talking about?" She said, at the same part of the river, this guy was fishing alone, and this other guy came and joined him to fish, and they would fish for the morning together. And he said, "What's your name anyway?" And whatever the guy's name was, so John Doe, So, "Oh, John Doe, what's your father's name?" He goes, "Oh, John Doe Sr." He goes, "I thought that. Are you guys from Sydney?" And he said, "Yeah." He goes, "I know your dad really well. I used to fish with him." He said, You tell him Big Dan said hi." And he said, "Okay, I will." And that guy went home and told his father. He goes, "Listen, man, I ran into an old guy you fished with there, Big Dan." He goes, "Big Dan? You ran into him?" He said, "Yeah." He said, "What did Big Dan look like?" And he explained to him. He goes, "Big Dan's been dead for 15 years.
Huh.
And the way he was described was the same guy that I saw in the woods that day on the same day."
Wow.
So that was my ghost story.
So and after, like, when you saw this guy and you walked off, like, it wasn't until that night that you felt anything was up. Like, it just seemed like a regular old guy cutting through the woods.
Yeah, I didn't realize anything. I just said, "Well, that's weird. Like, that this guy didn't see him here. Or maybe he was fishing a different part of the river. Maybe he was fishing somewhere else." Like, I just didn't care. Like, it didn't ever think to me that this could have been like the paranormal. Like, this was like just some random guy. But I remember he struck me as odd because of the way he greeted me with that like weird, like, yoo-hoo kind of thing. I'm like, whoa, this guy's a weird fella, or, you know what I mean? And then when I thought about it, the guy didn't have a fishing rod in his hand when he was coming through the woods. Like, when you're going through alders, you got like a rod over your head trying not to get it caught in trees and brush and stuff, right? And he was just kind of standing there in the middle of the woods, like through, I'm talking thick alders and bushes and rose bushes and things like that. Anyway, and it wasn't until I got home that night, my wife tells me a story. I didn't tell her about the guy. She told me about this guy. He said, "Yeah, he was fishing way upriver and ran into this guy." And I later found out what the guy was explained to look like. And I was like, that is the exact same dude that I saw in the woods.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's nuts. But it makes sense. A lot of people, like, if you could have any kind of afterlife, there are a lot of people who would spend it fishing and walking around on a river. So
yeah,
maybe that was just how he's deciding to spend his time, and it was just for whatever reason that day, a couple of people managed to get their eyes on him.
Yeah, who knows?
Well,
but
that was an awesome story. That had the hair on my arm standing up. The sound of the woohoo. That's freaky.
Know. Yeah. Oh yeah. Like, that's what I'm saying. Like, I'll never forget that guy, because I'm like, what kind of weirdo is this guy? Like, who greets someone like that in the woods? Yeah. Like, especially Cape Breton, it's usually like, "What's going on?"
Yeah.
You know?
Stop. Hey, bud.
Yeah, exactly.
He bums his smoke and carries on.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
There's a story from New Brunswick. I don't know if you ever heard of. There's a story of. It's called they call it the Dungarvan Whooper, or Dungarvan Whopper or Whooper, and it's like a ghost story about the woods in the Dungarvan River in New Brunswick. People hear somebody making like whooping sounds, going like whoop whoop, in the woods, and it's kind of when you were doing the woohoo, it kind of reminded me a bit of that. But yeah, that's awesome, James.
I fished the Dungarvan River.
Oh, did you?
I fished it several times, never heard the ghost story, but I'll tell you, it's so funny you say that. I've never had chills fishing in my life. I always got creeped out by that river.
Wow.
If you don't, the Dungarvan is absolutely in the middle of nowhere. It's literally like you go on a dirt road from this little town called Blackville, and you're on that dirt road for like an hour and a half before you get to the river, and it's like literally just pine trees and a dirt road, and you get to this river, and I always fish it, and I just think it was just the isolation. Like, man, I feel like I never ever got a good feeling about it. And it's funny you should say that. Maybe I was being watched by the Whooper guy.
Yeah, you should check it out, because maybe you were around there.
Well, I'm going to tell you, listen, if you got a second, I could tell you another ghost that I've seen, my wife and I have seen.
Yeah.
I'm attracted to this stuff. Have you ever heard of the Ingonish vampire?
No.
Now, so one night, and this is just really quickly, one night my wife and I were walking from the Ingonish chalets to the, oh my God, what's the name of that shitty old campground in Ingonish?
There's a lot of them out that way.
No, this is the worst one. Anyway, we were walking down and we heard someone kick a rock behind us, and it was only woods. There's only like there was no way he wouldn't have came out of the woods. And I turned around, and we just saw this huge black figure behind us with a huge top hat. And my wife looked at me and she went, "Look at that guy." And I said, I'm going to smash him with this bottle if he comes close to us, because we had a handle of rum with us.
Yeah.
And I turned around and he was gone. So anyway, her and I both said, like, we saw the same thing. And my wife, I might embellish things a little bit. She definitely doesn't.
Okay.
She's in public relations. And I brought this up to the guy who does the haunts from the Cape.
Yeah.
His kid and my kid were playing together on the playground. I said, yeah. And I told him my Margaree story, and I told him this one. And he said, my friend, you met the Ingonish vampire. And I guess when you go down to the Celtic Lodge some nights, you can look down on the rocks down there. You'll see him standing on the rocks and the waves pounding through him. And he just keeps standing there.
Wow.
Like, he's just like, it goes right through his apparition. Mm-hmm. But but I guess over the last 5 to 10 years, they're seeing him more and more and more down there. So pretty cool.
Wow, that's you're either lucky or unlucky or cursed.
I know.
Yoo-hoo.
Kristin, I got your message on Twitter. Your story sounds amazing, but before we get into it, tell me a bit about you. Who are you and where are you from?
I live in Burlington, Ontario, and I am usually an event producer, but during COVID, I am not at the moment.
Yeah, I guess the pandemic is not a good time for event producers.
Not when literally your job description is put a few thousand people together in a room and party. No.
Yeah. Well, and where's Burlington to Toronto? That's on the outskirts of Toronto, right?
About 45 minutes west.
Okay. And the story that you have to share takes place in, I believe, in Gravenhurst, Ontario. If I'm
Gravenhurst.
Okay, the word grave in there.
I know.
It's kind of fitting. Where is Gravenhurst?
Gravenhurst is in, you've probably heard of Muskoka, where people go to cottage.
Yeah.
Gravenhurst is part of Muskoka, so it's about 2 hours north of Burlington and about an hour and a half north of Toronto.
Okay. You say to cottage. This is a pretty, like, a rural area, I guess, when it's like country roads kind of place in Gravenhurst?
Yes, you have to drive 25 minutes off the most main highway to get there. But the bed and breakfast that we stayed in was right in town. Gravenhurst is just a small, cute little town that basically survives on tourism. And that's actually where my parents live now, is right in town. They only live a couple blocks now from the place that we stayed.
Okay, I'm almost picturing like the setting of any Stephen King novel, Gravenhurst, like that kind of town. Like
Oh,
on the outskirts of town is cottage country, but in town everyone has a dirty secret.
I don't know how many dirty secrets there are because it's mostly retirees.
Okay, you'd be surprised, I'm sure.
But maybe there's a lot of stories I don't know. It's just a tiny little town that is, your typical Canadian tiny little town where people would tell you, turn at the Tim Hortons, and everybody would know what that meant.
Yeah, that's a perfect way to put it. Because I totally get the type of town you're talking about now. So tell me what happened. It takes place in a bed and breakfast. So why were you staying at a bed and breakfast? And tell me what happened.
Sure. Well, my parents were just starting to build a cottage from scratch. They'd bought an empty plot of land and they were going to build this pretty large cottage on it. So they were going up for the weekend, on a long weekend, and just asked me at the last minute if I wanted to come to and see the progress. And I was like, sure, absolutely, that'd be great. Well, since all it was basically a hole in the ground at this point, it couldn't stay on the property that we bought. So my parents had a reservation at this little bed and breakfast on Hewson Street in Gravenhurst. And at the last minute, my dad called up the lady who ran it and just said, our daughter would really like to come. Do you have any extra rooms? And she said, well, no, not technically, but sometimes when this happens, I've made up the laundry room into an extra room, and it's nice, and there's a bed and everything, and I'll make it as nice as I can. And my dad was like, oh yeah, that's great, perfect, no problem. So the laundry room was the only room on the main floor of the house that had a guest in it, and that was only occasionally. The rest was like a living room and a kitchen and things like that. And everybody else was upstairs. So we didn't spend a lot of time at the bed and breakfast. It was literally just a place to sleep, a place to grab a meal, and then back out to work on the property that we had. So we get there in the evening and check in, basically, and it's very welcoming and everything. And so my parents go upstairs to their room, and the lady shows me to this laundry room, which was very spacious and lovely. But anyway, and I was like, great, wonderful. And she's like, have a good night. I'll be back in the morning, because she lived, I think it was across the street. Anyway, so I just got ready for bed. And as I'm getting ready for bed and really snuggling into the covers and just about to go to sleep, without a shadow of a doubt, it was as if it was happening. It was like an old grandmotherly lady came in, checked on me, tucked me in, basically made sure I had everything I wanted and knew that everything was good and this was a safe place and everything. And then I knew that that's what was happening, but it wasn't frightening. It was maybe slightly odd, but it was a very warm, comfy feeling.
Did you see did you think it was a real person? Or when you say you knew what was going on, like, could you tell this was something unique?
You could tell it was just a feeling. There was nothing to see. There was no light or glow or orb or any of that. It was truly just a feeling, and it was almost as if you were telepathically having a conversation. Like, I didn't say anything out loud. I didn't hear anything audible, but I absolutely knew exactly why she was there and what message she was conveying, like, without a doubt.
Wow. And what happened from there? Like, was it significant enough that you told people, like, the next morning or that night?
Absolutely. I got up the next morning, and I've always been totally fine with the concept of ghosts and, spent my time with a Ouija board as a teenager and all of those sorts of things. And I think being open to it is part of the whole experience. Mm-hmm. So at breakfast the next morning, I just said to the lady as she was bringing us juice and things like that, I said, oh, do you know you have a ghost? And she just stopped, and both my parents really just stopped, like, oh my gosh, she's finally lost it. Anyway, and the hostess of the bed and breakfast kind of stopped and was not at all surprised. And she said, well, it's not the first time I've heard that. And she said, why? What happened? And I told her that basically someone had come and tucked me in and checked on me at night, and how sweet it was. And it was an older lady, quite short, and all of this. And all of this, like I said, I didn't see anything. It was like I just knew. Anyway, and she said to me, she goes, it's strange that that's what you mention, because the woman who used to own this house, she used to use it as a boarding house. Like, she ran a boarding house because she was not married, and this had been their family home, and she had, I guess, inherited it or whatever. So the person who ran the bed and breakfast was actually able to bring out articles about this woman, like, that she had saved. I don't know whether they came with the house or what the story was on where she got them. But so she had pictures and stories and stuff of this woman running it as a rooming house. And I was like, absolutely, positively, that is who it was.
Okay, so before I tell you this, I wanted you to know that I am a lifelong skeptic of all things psychic and ghosts. I'm a very reasonable, logical person. I like science. I wouldn't consider myself a highly spiritual person, so I'm not really like a ghost story kind of person. But this still happened.
I'm so glad that they would reveal themselves to you.
I know, right? Of all people. So it was 2005, and it was like the year before I met my husband, and a close friend and I had signed a lease at an apartment in Brisbane, Australia. And so we were kind of going to be living together. It was going to be great. And the first few months went okay, but we kind of started to sense like a presence in the apartment. And so it was a 2-bedroom apartment, and I had the bedroom with an ensuite, and my friend had the other bedroom that had an adjacent bathroom that I kind of walked past down the hall. And so she was a hairdresser, and she would often be in there like blow drying her hair, and she would all of a sudden get a cold flash, and the hairs on her arms would start to stand up. And she told me that she felt that something was in the bathroom with her, but it wasn't malicious and it wasn't scary. So I was just kind of like, eh. And obviously I'm like, she was a lot more spiritual than I was. So I was just kind of like, oh, okay, you had this experience. Great. But a few days later, I was walking past her bathroom, and I felt that same flash of cold, and I can't really describe it very well, but the immediate feeling was that I had walked through someone, or they had walked through me, but we had passed through each other. And it was freaky, but again, not scary. And then by this point, my friend and I were kind of talking about it. And for some reason, we both instinctually knew, or thought, I guess, that whoever this thing was, it had a female energy. So we just kind of started calling her she. And so I was like, oh, I felt her last night or something. We would have these little experiences. And they were never scary. There was never any like rattling of doors or whatever, but it was always kind of a temperature and a feeling of a presence. And sometimes, and this was scary. What happened was scary, but I wasn't scared. But sometimes I would like wake up in the middle of the night and suddenly my heart would just be pounding, and I could sense her standing next to me. But it's so weird. But again, like there was nothing scary about it. There was no bad energy or I didn't feel like she was going to get me. She was just kind of standing there. Wow. And then things kind of continued to go on like this. We were there for 2 years. And then one night it all kind of came to a head. And so my friend and I used to love sitting out on the patio and smoking cigarettes and listening to music. And so we were doing that one night and chatting. And then all of a sudden, this kind of gust of wind came and there was a big pile of leaves on the balcony. And it kind of whipped them into a mini kind of whirlwind on the table that we were sitting at. So we're kind of sitting opposite each other on this round table, and on the table was like this whirlwind of leaves, and probably like 2 feet high. And we were just sitting there, it's between us, we're like looking at each other going, what the hell is going on? This like wind is just going around and around on the table. And then all of a sudden the leaves just dropped on the table and we knew that whatever happened was over. But it wasn't scary. It was almost like kind of a euphoric experience, like a really positive and happy experience. And certainly not one that I will ever forget. And we both kind of felt like whoever it was, like she was confirming to us at the same time that she was there, because before all our experiences had been separate. So I guess from that point we couldn't really deny what was happening. And I haven't told a lot of people about this because quite frankly it sounds ridiculous.
Hey Jordan, this is Nick from the East Coast, PEI, first time podder, long time listener. So I just want to tell you a little bit about a story that happened to me about 10 years ago. This was just before I got married. It was in Prince Edward Island in Rice Point. And I was at a friend's cottage before my wedding. And there's about 4 of us together. And we're kind of hanging out inside the house a little bit. And yes, we were having a few libations. So we were feeling rosy. But I stepped outside and kind of looked over the water there. It's got a great view of the water, so I could kind of see what's coming over. And then I saw, at that point, I saw a circular, I don't know what you call it, a round circle with a red light in the middle, and it was kind of, I'd say it was like hovering, silent, very silent. It was hovering and coming across the water, kind of towards us. And it stopped kind of where we were, and then it kind of kept going. And by this point, a couple of my friends experienced that, and it was pretty incredible. We went back inside, and I kind of felt that the experience wasn't over, for me at least. So I came back out, I stood on a picnic table, and at that point I looked to my left, and there it was. It was super close, and I could hit it with a frisbee close, just above the tree line. It scorched away towards Charlottetown pretty impressively. We took some old grainy videos on a Razor Motorola phone or something like that. Didn't really come out very well, of course. But I looked into your podcast later on. I saw that there was some reports of similar stuff in the area. So I thought that was pretty cool. So.
Hi Jordan, it's Lisa Terrio from the Supernatural Pet Sightings podcast. I had an unsettling experience that happened in my youth that I'd like to share. I would have been maybe 6 or 7 years old, and I had a black and white rabbit hound named Skippy. Skippy was more of a hunting dog than a family dog. I suppose my father didn't want the dog to become too domesticated, so he built a large insulated kennel on the back of the garage. From there, he extended some fencing so that Skippy would have room for exercise. I loved that dog. Every day I'd let the dog out of his kennel to play in the backyard. Eventually, the dog passed away. I can't remember exactly what happened. I just remember finding his kennel empty one day after school. I'm sure my parents had an explanation, but I can't remember what it was. About a year after his death, I was in the backyard when I saw something unusual in the corner of my eye. I turned my head in time to see a black shadow that looked like a dog. It was up against the garage wall, and my first thought, of course, was Skippy. I ran towards it, but this thing zipped around the garage and disappeared. I remember everything being dead silent. I mean, any animal running that fast would have been panting at least. You'd have heard the thud of paws on the ground, but there was no noise at all. I remember looking out over the field in the back of the house. I spun around looking for signs of this dog, but there was nothing. You might think if it were a dog, he could have ducked into another house, ran into the woods, or something like that, but where I lived in the country, you'd have at least seen him trailing off in one direction or another. Anyway, the moment passed, and another year went by before it happened again. I caught sight of the same dark shadow and took off after it. Once again, the shadow zipped around to the other side of the garage and disappeared into thin air. I was all alone in the yard, listening for sounds, scanning the property for any sign of a dog on the run. Nothing. I had this feeling like I was being watched, and the little hairs on my arms and the back of my neck pricked. For some reason, I had this feeling that I shouldn't be standing there, so I just went back in the house. I didn't tell my parents because I was pretty sure they wouldn't have believed me. Anyway, time went on, and it never happened again. But I never forgot about it. It's one of the reasons I started the Supernatural Pet Sightings podcast. I'm glad I did because, judging from my guest stories, it happens a lot more than you might think. Anyway, that's my story, Jordan. Thanks for letting me share.
Hey Jordan, I don't have a Halloween-specific spooky story, but I have a little story from when I was a kid. I was in my own bedroom. My brother had gotten his own bedroom, so I was by myself, but I still had the bunk bed in my room, and I was up on the top bunk, and I was trying to go to sleep. And I could hear footsteps one night in my room, somewhere on the carpet. And when you're a little kid, you get the image in your mind of where it is on the floor. Sort of, to me, it sort of felt like it was near the doorway to my room. And it wasn't like heavy footsteps, so that there wasn't any creaking of the floors or anything like that. It was just footsteps, so it was more like weightless feet on carpet, if you can kind of wrap your head around that idea. So anyways, I heard these footsteps, and it really scared me. I was listening, and it was just like, doot, doot, doot. And as a little kid, you're just like, okay, I've had enough of this. And I tore off down the hallway to the living room where my parents were, and they were watching TV. I can't quite 100% remember what they were watching. I believe it was Simon and Simon. So this would have been the early 80s. So I was probably around 8 or 9, maybe 10, and this just freaked the hell out of me. And later on, after we moved out of this place, I had a talk with my mother about it, and she didn't like the house either that much. It kind of spooked her a little bit, especially the basement. Nobody liked the basement. My brother eventually got a room in the basement. My dad renovated the basement and put a room in, and my brother moved down there, and Dad turned his old room into an office. And my mom said he used to see people down there. And given what's happened to me later on in life, I'm thinking that was probably more like going to sleep or waking up from sleep and you see people or see things. I've experienced the paralysis thing, but without the paralysis. So I wake up and my dreaming center doesn't quite turn off right away, and I'll see things or hear things. It's always really freaky, but and now that I'm older, I know what it is, and it's it still scares you, but you know what it is, so it doesn't frighten you. But I think maybe that might have been what he was seeing in the basement. He was waking up and it wasn't quite. But then again, I've never really talked to him about it. There was, it was a new house. It wasn't an old house. It's in rural Nova Scotia, and just outside of Truro. And I can't remember if it was my mom or my dad, but they told me when they dug the foundation, they found bones, and they found like ash, like there was a bonfire or something. So, it's the old trope of maybe there was a native settlement there, or there was some sort of ceremony that happened, or maybe they had buried somebody, or they could have just had dinner there one night. I don't know, but that was the story that was relayed to me. But anyway, that was a creepy old house. I don't know if the people that moved in there have ever felt anything weird about it, because a lot of this stuff tends to be in your own head. And I was a kid, and I was, God knows how much sugar I might have had that day, but that's my story.
I want to thank you for joining me for this collection of true stories. Whether you believe these witnesses or not, I think these, and the millions of stories like them, make me question if I'm ever truly alone. And with that, I'll end this episode of Nighttime. But before we part tonight, I have to give some thanks. First, a massive thank you to everyone who took their time to share their stories with me for this episode. You were all fantastic. And then, of course, a huge thank you to everyone listening. Without your interest and your support, Nighttime wouldn't be anything more than a vague specter haunting the memories of people who used to listen before the show died. But the battle to keep Nighttime out of the spirit world is still raging on, and I hope I can get your help. If you want to keep the show breathing, please subscribe to the Nighttime Premium feed. Not only does it make the show possible, it'll give you more of each topic than you're going to find in the free feed. For example, after this episode airs, I'm going to release a collection of listener-contributed stories that I originally aired back in 2006 and has long since been removed from the feed. You can subscribe to the premium feed at patreon.com/nighttimepodcast. And now, since I brought up the premium feed, I'm going to thank the newest subscribers. Kristin, Mary, Lisa, and Tracy, thank you for your generous support. And for anyone else who'd like to support the show but can't help financially, you can help keep Canada weird by simply sharing the episodes on social media. And if you have any story ideas or want to give me feedback on the show, you can reach me at nighttimepodcast.com/contact. As well, you'll find me on social media. I use Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and my handle is NighttimePod. Now, until next time, take care of each other, hug your loved ones tight, and let me know if you've seen something you can't explain.
The Nighttime Podcast is written, hosted, and produced by Jordan Bonaparte. Copyright Jordan Bonaparte.
Yoo-hoo! Yeah, so my name's Keith Mullins. I play music for a living. I live in Bedeck, Nova Scotia, and I have 3 kids and another one on the way.
You're a busy guy then.
Busy guy, yeah.
You had come to me with a collection of stories from past experiences you've had, but the one that really struck me was the story you had set in a train. I think you called it like a train house in Shubenacadie.
Right. Okay. So there's this house. If you're heading to Halifax from Cape Breton, and there's an overpass in Shubenacadie, and just after that overpass is this really striking looking tree, and it's actually in front of a huge McDonald's sign, and maybe some other advertisements. Well, right across the road from that is what in the neighborhood they call it the train station.
Okay.
Some people called it the post office, but I'm not sure if it ever was either of that. But I do know that when it was built, the guy that that built it, he was a Freemason, and he was high up in the Freemason, and they used to have ceremonies and meetings
Interesting.
in there a really long time ago. The house is really, really old. And so I had moved in through it was kind of through family that I got into the house and rented it, and I rented it for about 3 or 4 years. It was very cold. It's a brick building, and it was really cold in the winter, and I think I cut like 10 to 12 cords of wood just to keep the main room warm. Now, there was always noises in the house. Doors and cupboards were always randomly opening and closing. I remember when I moved in, they said, "Oh, you probably heard it's haunted," because it was through family, and I was like, "Yeah." So the first main story that I have was there was this one night I saw this hazy blue, looked like an elderly lady, and she walked by the room, and then she went upstairs, and there was all kinds of noises going on upstairs, and there was always noises upstairs, and it was like 3 a.m. and I turned on the lights, and I was like, "Is anybody here?" And no one answered, and I was like, "We live here, and we want to share the space," and it stopped. And then another thing that happened was my buddy Drew, who moved in with us, he had first moved upstairs, so all his stuff was upstairs, and he lasted like 2 days. He couldn't stay up there. He was so freaked, and so he moved back downstairs on the level that we were on, and all his stuff was up there, and he said his stuff was messed up, and he said there was 2 bar stools that he had, and he said when he came up like a day or two later, he said they were up against the window, like 2 people were looking out the window, and I hadn't changed them, and he hadn't changed them, and it was just like, but those are a few little things.
Wow. And you say you hear sounds from upstairs. Like in an old house, you're going to hear like kind of creaks and noises. Do you think it could have just been stuff like that, or do you get the feeling that there was more to it?
It could have been, but it really sounded like someone was walking around up there often.